The lights in the studio cast a sharp glow over the stage, illuminating the two figures seated across from each other. The air is thick with anticipation, the kind that precedes a televised confrontation designed to leave one party humiliated and the other victorious. Brian Livingston leans forward slightly, fingers drumming against the glossy surface of the desk, his expression carefully calibrated between polite curiosity and quiet contempt. He's done this before. He knows how to lead his guests into a trap, how to control the narrative, how to make them falter just enough for the world to see them unravel. Across from him sits Kayla Morrison. Her posture is relaxed but firm, her hands loosely folded in her lap. She isn't fidgeting, she isn't shifting uncomfortably in her seat. There's no sign of the nervous energy Brian is accustomed to seeing in guests who realize, too late, that they've walked into an ambush. She's calm, composed, waiting. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy heartfelt stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story, so after watching, leave a comment below and tell us what you think. And don't forget, tomorrow, we have another inspiring story just for you. Kayla, let's get straight to it, Brian says, his voice smooth, almost gentle, though the sharpened edge beneath it is unmistakable. You worked in the White House during one of the most controversial administrations in American history. You were part of an operation that, let's be honest, spent 4 years manipulating the media, misleading the public, and actively undermining democratic institutions. My question is simple: how do you live with that? A hush falls over the studio. The audience, though silent, is engaged, leaning in, waiting for the moment she stumbles, the moment she blinks, the moment she gives them something they can dissect and replay in 10-second clips across social media. Kayla tilts her head slightly, as if considering his words. She doesn't rush to fill the silence. She lets it stretch, lets it settle. Brian's fingers stop drumming. The pause is lasting longer than he expected. Finally, she exhales softly and leans forward, mirroring his posture. "That's an interesting question," she says, her tone neutral, measured. "But I think it says more about you than it does about me." A flicker of confusion crosses Brian's face. It's quick, almost imperceptible, but the camera catches it. The audience catches it, and in that brief instant, the balance of power in the conversation shifts, ever so slightly. The studio is designed for confrontation. The lights are angled perfectly to cast just enough shadow to make everything feel dramatic, almost theatrical. The backdrop is sleek, modern, the kind of aesthetic that suggests professionalism but is carefully engineered to feel cold, impersonal. The audience sits in neatly arranged rows, their faces barely visible beyond the stage. They are not just spectators, they are part of the script. Their reactions, the murmurs, the occasional gasps, all feed into the spectacle that is about to unfold. Brian Livingston is in his element. A veteran journalist with a reputation for tearing his guests apart with precision, he thrives on these moments. He knows exactly how to construct his questions to push his target into a corner, to make them sweat, to force a reaction that can be clipped, headlined, and circulated within minutes. He presents himself as calm, reasonable, a man of facts, but his strength lies in something far more insidious. He builds a narrative before his guest even opens their mouth. By the time they realize what's happening, it's too late. Across from him sits Kayla Morrison, and she does not look like someone who has walked into a trap. If anything, she looks like she saw it from a mile away and stepped into it anyway. She is impeccably dressed, understated but sharp, her posture betraying none of the tension Brian is hoping to provoke. There is an ease in the way she carries herself, a quiet confidence that comes not from arrogance, but from knowing exactly what kind of game is being played. She isn't here to win the audience over. She isn't here to apologize. She's here because she understands the weight of the moment better than Brian does. The air between them is tense but still. It's the kind of quiet that precedes a storm, the kind that makes people lean in without realizing it. The control room is watching closely, cameras trained to catch every subtle movement, every flicker of emotion that might betray a weakness. The producers are waiting for Brian's moment, the part where he lands the perfect blow, the one that will make headlines tomorrow. He is known for them. He dismantled senators, CEOs, actors who thought they could outmaneuver him. Kayla Morrison is just another name to add to the list. but something about her stillness unsettles him. Most guests, even the seasoned ones, give something away. The tapping of fingers against the chair, the tightening of the jaw, the darting of eyes searching for an escape route. But Kayla? She just watches him, not with hostility, not with defensiveness, with something else. Something Brian can't quite name, but he recognizes the feeling. It's the same quiet calculation he sees in himself before he goes in for the kill. The silence stretches, an invisible tug-of-war over who will speak next. Brian is used to controlling the pace, but Kayla is playing a different game. She lets the quiet settle just long enough for it to become uncomfortable. The audience is watching, waiting. The control room is watching, waiting. Brian, for the first time in a long time, feels like he's the one being sized up. He exhales, straightens slightly in his chair, and forces an easy smile. "You seem comfortable," he remarks, tilting his head just a fraction. It's a small attempt at regaining control, at making her acknowledge that this is his arena. Kayla offers the faintest smile in return. "I've been in more hostile rooms than this." The words are simple, almost dismissive, but the weight behind them is unmistakable. She is reminding him, without saying it outright, that she has been under more scrutiny than he can imagine, that whatever he thinks he has prepared, whatever tricks he plans to use, she has already considered them. Brian studies her for a beat longer than he should. Then, with a flicker of something almost imperceptible, something that could be irritation or maybe something closer to intrigue, he shifts his focus back to his notes. The game has begun. But for the first time in a long time, he isn't entirely sure he's the one setting the rules. Brian glances down at his notes, then back up at Kayla. The calculated pause is intentional. It's a technique he has perfected over the years. Let the silence hang just long enough to create unease, just enough to suggest that what comes next will be damning. When he finally speaks, his tone is measured, but the words are sharp. "Kayla, I want to be fair here. I really do. But we both know that the administration you worked for wasn't exactly known for transparency. You were part of a communications team that, let's be honest, spent more time attacking the press than answering real questions. How do you justify that?" The trap is clear. The framing is designed to put her on the defensive, to make her scramble to correct the record, to deny, to deflect. It's how these interviews usually go. The guest spends half the time trying to undo the narrative Brian weaves before they've even had a chance to speak. But Kayla doesn't react the way he expects. She doesn't rush to answer. She doesn't flinch. Instead, she shifts slightly in her seat, just enough to signal that she's adjusting by choice, not out of discomfort. Her expression remains neutral, almost amused. "I appreciate the concern, Brian," she says smoothly, her voice controlled. "But let's not pretend that hostility between the press and the White House began in 2016. You've been in this business long enough to know that..." A flicker of something crosses Brian's face. He expected pushback, but not so quickly, not so precisely. He adjusts, recalibrates. "That may be true, but the difference here is that your administration actively discredited journalism as a whole. You called facts fake news. You demonized reporters who were just trying to do their jobs. Do you really think that was responsible leadership?" The first real attack lands. There is an audible shift in the studio. Audience members leaning in, waiting for the moment she stumbles, the moment she reveals even a hint of uncertainty. Brian's tone remains even, but there is something in his eyes that betrays his anticipation. He thinks he has her cornered. He thinks he's about to watch her try to spin her way out of it. Kayla exhales lightly, just a fraction of a smile at the edge of her lips. "Brian, if we're going to talk about demonizing the press, let's talk about how certain networks spent 4 years labeling half the country as extremists simply because they voted a certain way. Let's talk about how journalists, including some sitting in this very building, pushed stories they knew were false because they served a narrative." You're asking me to answer for mistrust in the media, but tell me, does your industry ever answer for itself? A murmur ripples through the audience. It isn't loud, but it's enough. Brian stiffens almost imperceptibly, and for the first time, his rehearsed poise flickers. His job is to control the conversation, to dictate the terms, but Kayla has just forced him onto unstable ground. This was supposed to be an interrogation, a dismantling, but suddenly it feels like something else. He presses forward, unwilling to lose momentum. "So you're saying the media is the real enemy here?" he asks, a subtle smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He thinks he's found his opening, a way to paint her as paranoid, conspiratorial. It's a classic play. Make the guest sound unreasonable, let the audience fill in the rest. Kayla doesn't take the bait. She doesn't even blink. "I'm saying that accountability should go both ways. You want to talk about misinformation? Fine, let's talk about it. But let's be honest about where it comes from." Her words are steady, deliberate. She isn't raising her voice, but the weight of them hangs heavy in the air. The cameras zoom in, capturing Brian's expression as he processes what's happening. He came in prepared for a predictable defense, for justifications and denials. Instead, she is flipping the script, forcing the conversation into territory he hadn't planned for. He straightens in his chair, glancing briefly at the control room monitor, before returning his gaze to Kayla. He needs to regain control, to steer this back to the narrative he intended. He reaches for the stack of papers in front of him, flipping through them with a calculated air of authority. "Well," he says, "since we're talking about accountability, let's address something directly. I have here multiple reports from insiders, people who worked with you, who claim that the White House actively pressured staff to mislead the public. Some say it was a daily occurrence, that it wasn't just about politics, but about creating an alternate reality for the American people. What do you say to that?" The shift in strategy is subtle but clear. If broad accusations don't shake her, he'll make it personal. He'll introduce anonymous sources, unverifiable but damaging, designed to plant a seed of doubt in the audience's mind. This is where most guests begin to falter, where the weight of vague allegations forces them into an exhausting cycle of denial and explanation. Kayla remains unfazed. She doesn't even glance at the papers he's holding. "People say a lot of things, Brian. Some of them are true. Some of them are designed to create headlines. The difference is whether or not you care enough to verify before repeating them." The room is silent. The audience is watching closely, sensing the tension rising. The usual rhythm of Brian's interviews, attack, scramble, retreat, is missing. Kayla isn't scrambling, she isn't retreating, she is holding the line. And the more she does, the more apparent it becomes that this interview isn't going the way Brian intended. Brian's fingers tighten around the papers in front of him, but he quickly releases them, as if realizing that gripping them too hard would make his frustration obvious. His eyes flicker to the control room monitor for the briefest second before returning to Kayla, his expression carefully composed but losing some of its earlier ease. He isn't used to this. His guests don't usually hold the line this well. They deflect, they fumble, they scramble for footing. But Kayla, she is standing firm, and the longer she does, the more obvious it becomes that the usual tactics aren't working. He leans forward, his voice sharpening. "So you're saying every single person who's spoken out against that administration is lying? That every former staffer who's come forward with accounts of chaos and deception is just making it up?" The question is delivered with the weight of someone who believes he's finally cornered his opponent, the final push meant to force her into either discrediting herself or admitting guilt. Kayla exhales lightly, her eyes steady. "I'm saying that narratives are built on what people want to believe. If you want to find disillusioned staffers willing to say whatever supports your headline, you will. Just like if I wanted to find former journalists who would call your profession a machine for manufactured outrage, I could." The audience shifts, a subtle energy moving through the room. Brian notices it too. He isn't losing control yet, but the momentum is slipping and he knows it. He pivots. "You're deflecting, Kayla. Let's focus. The American people deserve the truth, and for 4 years, they didn't get it. There were deliberate lies coming from that podium every day. Are you seriously sitting here telling me that you never misled the public?" There it is, the direct accusation, meant to unnerve, to shake her just enough to break through her composure. The question is designed to be a no-win scenario. If she denies it outright, he'll pull up out-of-context clips, claim she's rewriting history. If she hesitates even for a second, he'll seize it as proof of guilt. It's the kind of question that has undone many before her. Kayla leans forward just slightly, meeting his gaze without a flicker of hesitation. The truth? The truth is that every administration, every politician, every journalist sitting in a seat like yours spins stories to fit their interests. The only difference is who gets called out for it. Brian lets out a short laugh, a calculated, dismissive sound. So now it's the everyone does it defense? That's a weak argument, Kayla. If everyone is guilty, then no one is, right? Her smile doesn't waver. No, Brian. It means that you don't get to act like you're the final authority on what's true and what's not. His jaw tightens for just a second before he shakes his head, shifting gears again. Let's talk about something specific then. January 6th. The country watched as a violent mob stormed the Capitol, fueled by lies that your administration helped spread. You were there, Kayla. You saw what was happening, and yet you still defended it. Do you regret that? There is an unmistakable shift in the air. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface now crackles, sharp and immediate. Brian knows what he's doing. He has thrown down a line that forces her into one of the most politically radioactive topics of the decade, a subject designed to either force an admission of guilt or enrage half the country. It's the kind of question that can end careers in a single misstep. Kayla doesn't flinch. I defended the right to ask questions about an election that millions of Americans believed was flawed. I defended the idea that a government should answer to its people, even when the questions are inconvenient. What I don't defend is the way the media took that day and turned it into a single convenient narrative that left no room for nuance. Brian's lips part slightly, as if ready to pounce, but she isn't finished. You and I both know that there were people in that crowd who were there for the wrong reasons. But we also both know that the second it became politically useful, the media erased every detail that didn't fit the story they wanted to tell. They ignored the fact that thousands of people were there peacefully. They ignored that members of Congress had raised concerns about election integrity long before that day. They ignored anything that didn't serve the message. And now, years later, you sit here and act like the only deception worth discussing is the one that's convenient for you. The audience is no longer just watching, they are reacting. Brian can hear it. The quiet murmurs, the slight shifts in energy. He knows what this means. This is the part where he should be in control, where the guest should be floundering under pressure. Instead, it's him who is feeling the weight of the moment. He needs to turn this around. He forces a tight smile, shaking his head. That's quite the pivot. So, just to be clear, you're saying the media is to blame for how January 6th is remembered? Kayla tilts her head slightly. I'm saying the media chooses what to make history and what to erase. And you know that. A sharp silence follows. For the first time, Brian's usual rhythm is off. He has spent years perfecting the art of the televised takedown, of crafting the kind of moments that dominate news cycles for days. But Kayla isn't falling into the pattern. She isn't scrambling. She isn't apologizing. She isn't trying to reframe her past. She is standing in it, forcing him to acknowledge that this interview isn't going as planned, and the longer she does, the more the audience can feel it. Brian inhales sharply through his nose, the telltale sign of a man trying to recalibrate. He had expected resistance, maybe even a spirited defense, but he had not anticipated this. A controlled counteroffensive that was slowly tilting the entire dynamic of the interview. He glances at his notes, flipping through the pages as if searching for something. Some line, some statistic, something that can wrestle the momentum back into his hands. He knows he needs to regain control before this slips any further. So let's just be absolutely clear, Kayla, he says, his voice measured but firmer now. You're suggesting that the way January 6th was covered was as much a manipulation as the event itself? Kayla doesn't blink. I'm suggesting that selective storytelling is its own form of propaganda. And you know that, Brian, because you've built a career on it. His lips press together, his fingers tightening on the stack of papers in front of him. That hit deeper than he would like to admit, but he recovers quickly. That's a bold accusation. And it's ironic, considering you were part of an administration that, let's be honest, weaponized misinformation on a daily basis. There it is again, the attempt to redirect, to shift her onto the defensive. But Kayla sees it coming. She exhales slightly, her posture unchanged. Tell me something, Brian. Do you remember June of 2020? His eyes narrow slightly, the shift in her tone catching him off guard. I don't see how that's relevant. Ooh, I think you do, she says smoothly. I think you remember very well how, for months, cities were burning, businesses were destroyed, lives were upended, and yet the media, your colleagues, called it mostly peaceful protests. I think you remember how some of the very same people sitting in newsrooms right now justified the chaos because it served their political interests. But when the wrong people got angry, suddenly protests weren't acceptable anymore. Suddenly outrage became insurrection. The room changes. The audience, which had been murmuring quietly, falls into an almost eerie stillness. Brian shifts in his chair, his expression unreadable, but the tension in his jaw betrays him. He wasn't expecting this. She isn't just holding her ground. She's forcing him to acknowledge something he doesn't want to acknowledge. He shakes his head, exhaling sharply. That's a false equivalency. You're comparing a movement for racial justice to an attack on democracy. Kayla tilts her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. I'm comparing the way the media decided which rage was righteous and which was dangerous. I'm comparing the way you and people like you drew lines in the sand, not based on principle, but on politics. I'm comparing the fact that destruction was excused when it was convenient and condemned when it wasn't. And I'm asking you, Brian, if you really believe your job is to report the truth or just the version of it that suits your narrative. Brian swallows, and for the first time in the interview, he doesn't immediately respond. That brief pause is everything. The cameras catch it, the audience feels it, and for the first time, the power dynamic in the room has completely flipped. Kayla leans forward, her voice quieter now but sharper. You say my administration misled the public. Maybe it did. Maybe every administration does. But the difference is, I was never the one pretending to be impartial. Brian's mouth opens slightly, as if he wants to respond, but he knows anything he says now will sound like an excuse. He isn't used to this feeling, not here, not in his own studio, not in front of his own audience. The silence stretches, heavy, charged. And for the first time in his career, Brian Livingston looks like a man who has lost control of the conversation. The silence lingers longer than it should. Brian shifts in his chair, glancing briefly toward the control room as if expecting someone to intervene, to cut to commercial, to do anything to break the tension that is now suffocating the space between them. But no one moves. No one speaks. The audience, the cameras, the entire room is locked onto the scene unfolding in front of them. Kayla remains still, unbothered, watching him with the quiet patience of someone who knows she has already won. Brian exhales sharply, straightening his posture as he forces a thin smile. You seem to have a lot of opinions about the media, Kayla. But let's be honest here. You were part of an administration that thrived on division, that fueled distrust in institutions. And now you want to sit here and act like you're the victim? Kayla lets out the smallest breath of laughter, shaking her head just slightly. Brian, I'm not a victim. And that's what's bothering you, isn't it? You came here expecting me to defend myself, to beg for credibility on your terms. But I don't need to. Because unlike you, I never pretended to be neutral. The blow lands with surgical precision. A murmur ripples through the audience, a quiet but undeniable shift in energy. Brian clenches his jaw, his grip tightening on the edge of the desk. He knows this moment is slipping from his hands. The usual rhythm of these interviews, the control, the slow unraveling of his guest, the triumphant final question that buries them, it isn't happening. Instead, he is the one scrambling, the one being dissected in real time. He knows that if he doesn't regain his footing now, this will be the clip that circulates online. This will be the moment people remember. He inhaled sharply. So that's it? You're saying everything your administration did was justified? That there was no corruption, no deception, no wrongdoing? Kayla doesn't hesitate. I'm saying that every government in history has done things the public would call deceptive. I'm saying that if you believe this is a one-sided problem, then you are either lying to your audience or to yourself. Brian's face tightens, but he quickly covers it with another forced smile. He glances at the time monitor, realizing he has only minutes left. He needs to land something, anything, that will shift the focus back in his favor. "All right," he says, voice leveling out again. "One last question. Do you regret it? Do you regret being a part of that administration?" Kayla finally leans back in her chair, crossing her arms loosely, studying him. The question is meant to be the final blow, the invitation for a moment of remorse, for a carefully scripted attempt at rehabilitation, but she doesn't give it to him. She holds the silence just long enough before answering. "No." The word drops like a stone, no qualifiers, no hesitation, just a simple, undeniable statement. Brian blinks. It isn't what he expected. He was counting on something. Deflection? Rationalization? At the very least, a softened version of the truth. But she has given him nothing. She tilts her head slightly. "Do you regret yours?" The audience shifts. Brian's face flickers, just for a second, with something he can't quite mask. She doesn't elaborate, doesn't explain what she means. She doesn't have to. The weight of the question hangs between them, open-ended, loaded with implications that he cannot unpack in the seconds remaining. The cameras catch it, the hesitation in his expression, the brief but unmistakable moment where the man who always has an answer suddenly has none. The control room flicks a signal. Time's up. The stage manager gestures subtly for Brian to wrap it up, but for the first time, he doesn't seem eager to do so. His fingers drum once against the desk before he exhales, turning to face the camera. "That's all the time we have," he says, his voice carefully neutral. "Kayla Morrison, thank you for being here." Kayla simply nods. No added words, no last attempt at explanation or justification. She doesn't need them. She has already said everything she came to say. The moment the show cuts to commercial, Brian peels off his microphone, his expression carefully blank as he avoids looking at her. He knows what just happened. He knows that when this airs, the headlines won't be about how he exposed a former White House staffer. They will be about how, for the first time in his career, he was the one on the defensive. Kayla stands, unhurried, composed, adjusting the sleeves of her jacket as she turns toward the exit. She doesn't look back. She doesn't need to. The moment is already out of his hands. Within minutes of the interview ending, the internet erupts. Clips of Kayla Morrison dismantling Brian Livingston flood every platform: Twitter, YouTube, TikTok, Facebook. It doesn't take long before the most explosive moments are turned into bite-sized clips, perfectly packaged for virality. The moment she asks, "Do you regret yours?" spreads like wildfire. Some call it the turning point, others label it the question that ended the interview. Reaction videos appear within the hour, breaking down every second, analyzing Brian's body language, the shift in his tone, the exact moment he lost control. The comment sections are ruthless. "I've never seen him look so uncomfortable. She walked in prepared and he never saw it coming. This is what happens when you invite someone on thinking you're going to humiliate them and instead get exposed on live TV." On Twitter, hashtags take over. Kayla Morrison exposes media trends at #1 within the first 2 hours. Livingston meltdown isn't far behind. Political influencers from both sides weigh in, some praising her composure, others desperately trying to reframe the conversation. Legacy media outlets attempt damage control, publishing hastily written think pieces about how Kayla Livingston pressed for the truth and how Brian Livingston pressed for the truth. But it doesn't work. The audience has already made up its mind. Under every critical article, the comments are merciless. "You're really going to pretend we didn't just watch what we watched? You guys do this every time one of your own gets exposed." This is why people don't trust mainstream media anymore. By the next morning, YouTube's trending page is filled with titles like "Kayla Morrison destroys Brian Livingston." This interview did not go as planned. Corporate media just got humiliated on live TV. Independent commentators rip apart Brian's performance, dissecting his failed attempts to regain control. A side-by-side clip comparing his usual dominance over guests versus his stunned silence with Kayla racks up millions of views. He's used to steamrolling people. This time, he met someone who didn't flinch. The reaction is overwhelming. Even some of Brian's longtime viewers admit they've never seen him struggle like that. The network executives scramble. Inside the newsroom, the tension is palpable. Producers hold emergency meetings trying to assess the damage. One executive suggests Brian should address the backlash directly, maybe release a statement, do a follow-up interview, try to frame it as a healthy debate. Another argues it would only make things worse. The internet has already decided this was a disaster. Anything we say now just feeds the fire. There's no easy way out. Brian himself remains quiet, avoiding social media, staying out of the public eye as his team scrambles for a way to move past the humiliation. Meanwhile, Kayla does nothing. No Twitter posts, no press releases, no follow-up interviews. She simply disappears from the conversation, letting the footage speak for itself. And that silence is what makes it even more powerful. The lack of response from her fuels the narrative. She didn't need to defend herself because she had already won. Commentators note how her refusal to engage only deepens the impact. He left him to deal with the fallout while she moved on, like it was just another day. Days later, the clip is still everywhere. It has become one of those cultural moments that refuses to fade, the kind of interview that gets referenced for years whenever media bias is discussed. The damage to Brian's credibility is done. The question is no longer whether he can recover, it's whether the audience will ever look at him the same way again.